But first, most who work in the media would be aware of the activist group Sleeping Giants, a group which bullies news organisations, journalists and advertisers when content falls outside the orthodoxy of views held on Twitter. Sleeping Giants makes itself out to be a large and influential organisation, but its numbers are vastly exaggerated, and many of the images or videos it posts to social media are doctored or deceptively cut to remove any context from complicated debates. In actuality, the group in media in Australia is made up of a handful of anonymous Twitter users who are too cowardly to use their real names. And now we know why. The founders of the US Sleeping Giants were unmasked by journalists in 2018. Enter Matt Rivitz and Nandini Jammi, two friends who would soon become entangled in a sorry story of jealousy and egos, muddled with accusations of racism and sexism. Picture the ancient Egyptian symbol of a snake eating its own tail. Well, at first, Matt attempted to portray the Sleeping Giants as a benevolent and friendly group that used gentle persuasion to convince advertisers to withdraw their business. Well, CNN wasn't quite convinced.
How do you stop a slippery slope of soft power that ends up being a form of censorship where activist communities on the right and left simply harass sites they don't like?
Yeah, I mean, we've tried to keep things really polite, and we let the advertisers know in a polite way. We don't feel like we're forcing them to do anything. They react, and again, they thank us for letting them know.
Jammi was more forthcoming about the organisation's purpose. Here she is late last year.
We've really managed to shift the narrative over the past few years. I think the public really has started to really understands the relationship that tech businesses and businesses in general have with white nationalism and hate speech. You can't really get at answering questions in the age of social media. It's going to follow you wherever you go. So this is something you can't ignore. What you have to do, though, or what you have to do instead, is be aware that the way that you answer, the way that you don't answer, even non-answers count, will result in real-life business risks and rewards.
Things eventually turned sour between the pair, with Nandini now accusing Matt of gaslighting her and using her, a woman of colour, for free labour. It turns out while Nandini was busy running the group's Facebook page, Matt was travelling the world on speaking tours and even walked away with a Cannes Gold Lion, the biggest award in advertising. No glory was given to poor Nandini, and that prompted her to quit the Sleeping Giants and shame its co-founder in a venomous op-ed. How my white male co-founder gaslighted me out of the movement we built together, she wrote, announcing she was leaving the Sleeping Giants. It turns out Matt, the self-styled Sleeping Giant, was very much the ogre. Among the many things he had done to sideline Jammi and take credit for the organisation's work was his refusal to acknowledge her as a co-founder. He even denied her a request for an official email address and insisted she forward him all press requests. I felt humiliated, wrote Nandini. I spent the week unable to eat, sleep or function. I'd put my personal website that I am the founding organiser of the Sleeping Giants. Would people think I was lying about my involvement? Was I just here performing free labour in service of a white man's personal brand? It turns out, yes, she was. Rivitz tweeted an apology the next day, acknowledging that she was indeed the co-founder of the organisation. Nandini clearly deserves a lot more credit than she has gotten for groundbreaking work with Sleeping Giants, and I'd like to apologise to her and to anyone who may have felt this way during the course of the campaign, as volunteers or as followers, he wrote. I don't know where the Sleeping Giants goes from here, but I hope the mission can continue and get stronger from this. I sincerely hope I can too. Well, what hypocrisy. The Sleeping Giants is an organisation that believes its ideas of morality are so pure and so correct that it has no issue lobbying advertising agencies to abandon news organisations it disagrees with. Make no mistake, this can result in job losses. But for these two, none of that matters. Only fame does. And here in Australia, that trend repeats. Another activist group, the Mad Witches, claims its censorship and cancel culture campaigns have been falsely credited to the Australian Sleeping Giants, which has, quote, male management. And as grubby the Sleeping Giants founder in the US is, at least the public know who Matt Rivitz is. He is accountable for his words and for his actions. All we know about the Australian Sleeping Giants is that its most prolific contributor, Andrew Priest, is a lecturer at Edith Cowan University, an organisation given $150 million from the Australian government each year. Mr. Priest tweets constantly during work hours and has racked up more than 3,500 tweets involving a Sleeping Giants cause. Now, that accounts for roughly 35% of all Sleeping Giants tweets. If the company doesn't cave to his activism, he writes to the company executives directly. He also uses enterprise-grade bots to spam companies to make the supporter base look far bigger than it really is. And if he still doesn't get the result, well, he doxes the CEOs on Twitter and sends the mob right after them. And he does it all while at the same time working at a university which is heavily subsidised by you, the Australian taxpayer. Advertisers who cower to the demands of this unruly rabble ought to know who they are really getting in bed with. What you thought was legitimate outrage from the masses could simply be the ramblings of one lonely career complainer. Sky News sent Andrew Priest a series of questions about his role in online activism, but did not hear back by deadline. Now let's bring in the panel for this evening. I'm joined by Sky News contributor Jammi and veteran broadcaster Kel Richards. Kel, how are you?
G'day, mate. Lovely to be here.
And Gemma, how are you?
Great today from the shut-in state of Westralia, Jack.
Well, I'm glad to have you both. Look, let's hop straight into it. Why don't we start with the Sleeping Giants over in the US? Gemma, what are your thoughts on this kind of activism? Do you think it's gone too far?
Well, there's no question it's gone too far, Jack, because what it does, as you so clearly outlined in your editorial, is it misrepresents who is saying, the volume of people who are saying things and what they're saying. This is tantruming children who are using technology to bully corporations who, quite frankly, lack the courage to stand up to them and say, we're not here to tell people how to live their lives. We're here to provide a good and a service and let people make that decision for themselves. And I'm so glad that you clarified or touched on the situation within Australia, because, of course, that Edith Cowan lecturer, Edith Cowan University is based here in my state, and that story got quite a lot of publicity at the time, as it should. Because what Sleeping Giants trade on and what these mobs trade on, because they are mobs, is fear and intimidation. It's corporate bullying. It's grown-up bullying for people who clearly have nothing better to do. And the greatest disappointment is the lack of leadership in corporate Australia, many of whom, examples of whom have folded like a house of cards at the slightest pressure. And that speaks to, in my view, a wider malaise in our corporate community, businesses and business leaders not able to stand up and go, you know what, not going to be bullied. We don't allow bullying in our workplace, so we're not going to also allow bullying at a corporate level. That's what's needed, in my view. These organisations aren't fighting for justice. They aren't fighting for anything other than an agenda that is entirely their own. That's all this is.
Well said. And Kel, I think part of the problem is that these activists give the appearance, using enterprise-grade bots to make their support base look so much larger, that if you're, a young media executive at a company, you get quite scared, thinking that the entire world is against you.
Look, Jack, it's not just young media executives. They've been making the same mistake for years and years and years. I spent a long time in commercial radio, and there'd be some complaints about something. A dozen complaints would come in, and the program director would come and say, oh, look at this, we've got a dozen complaints or 2 dozen complaints. And I say, you have 200,000 listeners. Yeah. Do you realise how unimportant that is? Yeah. The thing about Sleeping Giants is I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall at the founding meeting when these two got together. Listen, I've got this great idea. Let's set up an organisation that will bully. It will just exist to bully people, and at the same time, let's go for dishonesty. Let's pretend there are thousands of us when there are 2 of us, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, how on earth do you set up how can you, with any sort of moral backbone, set up an organisation based on bullying and dishonesty? And by the way, how can that woman be concerned that she's been bullied dishonestly? That's what she set up the organisation to do. Yeah. It's the corporate culture of Sleeping Giants. So they are just acting in accordance with their own policy and their own corporate culture. And they should be, as I've been telling managers for years and years in radio, you just ignore these people. Why big corporations with a turnover of millions look at a handful of complaints, even 1,000 complaints, and say that matters? I don't understand. Lack of spine, lack of backbone, lack of understanding. There's something unhelpful in the corporate sector, as you said, Jeff.
I think it's a combination of all above. Look, let's move to another issue, which is a byproduct of bullying again, and a byproduct of not being able to accept views which are different to yours. There is a columnist, a centrist columnist in America called Barry Weiss, and she tragically has had to resign from her posting at the New York Times because of bullying for people that don't like that she dares interview conservatives from occasion. Now, there is a brilliant quote that I want to read from her in an open letter explaining her decision, which kind of encapsulates the problem. A new consensus has emerged in the press, she writes, but perhaps especially at this paper, that truth isn't a process of collective discovery, but an orthodoxy already known to an enlightened few, whose job is to inform everyone else. Twitter is not the masthead of the New York Times, but Twitter has become its ultimate editor. Gemma, what do you think about this situation?
Well, firstly, I applaud her bravery, and secondly, I choose my words carefully, Jack, but it's almost there's almost a bittersweet enjoyment in seeing the left eat its own and seeing the once mighty New York Times. It's actually a shame as a journalist to see the once mighty New York Times imploding and eating itself, but that's exactly what is happening. The moment that an organisation, let alone a news organisation, begins to believe its own agenda, set its own agenda, rather than questioning. I mean, the fundamental job of any journalist is fairness and accuracy. It's fairness and accuracy to question, to be curious, to not stop until the answers have made themselves clear, and then even keep going, because answers can change as circumstances change. But what we've seen in the New York Times, as Barry Weiss has pointed out, is this sick, toxic culture of wokeism that has infected what used to be news coverage and turned it into the very worst of agenda-based journalist activism. That's not news. It's not fairness. It's not accuracy. And I'm going to go out on a limb here, Jack. I'm going to say I question whether even a newspaper as once great as the New York Times can survive as it goes further and further down the sordid black hole of wokeness insofar as news coverage. Will it end up like the Guardian, begging contributors to pay its bills every time you log on to the website? I mean, I genuinely don't see how it can survive long term, because unless they haven't been paying attention, the pendulum is swinging back the other way. Everyday people on the street can recognise what is garbage news, what is agenda, and what isn't. Look at CNN's ratings as a starter. Look at some of the news organisations in Australia. I think it's a terrible, terrible shame, but more power to Barry Weiss, not just for walking away, but walking away with dignity and clearly explaining why she's done so, putting to shame, may I add, the people she's left behind.
Yeah, particularly considering that she is a centrist. She isn't even a conservative. Yeah. She isn't even centre-right. Yeah. She's middle of the road, and she can't even stomach the culture at the New York Times.